don't know why this seems so wobbly.
Thanks, but I'm going to point it the other way because I'm using the wireless mic and I'm not back there to turn on the hanging mics today. Okay. Well, good morning.
That's an example of Christian fellowship.
No, this is social distancing. Good morning to those of you here in the auditorium and also to those who are with us through our live stream. If you were here for last week's class, you already know that Andy is not here today. He has taken our teens to a youth forum in Montana this weekend, so I'm standing in for him today. I looked through my computer and it appears it's been like 3 years since I taught this class, which means I'm out of practice. But at the moment it looks like you'll only have to put up with me for 1 week, so we should both survive that. I will say to those of you who are watching our live stream, since no one is back in the back operating the stream and therefore the audio, it may be very difficult for you to hear what anyone else in the auditorium says. I apologize for that, but all our other usual operators are off in Montana. If those of you who are in the auditorium have something to say, and I hope you will, it would help if you would speak up, speak out, you know. Yeah. Or that one. You can yell, whatever. Anyway, besides that, my hearing the last several years keeps getting a little bit worse, so. Okay. For today's class, I have actually revamped some notes from a Wednesday night class we did a number of years ago. Now, those of you in here may have been here when we did that, but it was a long time ago. We were doing an extended study on people of the Bible, and the idea was that there are lessons to be learned for us today from almost everything somebody does in the scriptures. So, in fact, in particular, Paul pointed out that Israel's history should serve as an example for us. In 1 Corinthians 10, verse 6, he wrote, "Now these things occurred as examples to keep us from setting our hearts on evil things as they did." Of course, he had in mind bad examples, as in don't do what they did. But the principle obviously works both ways. And in fact, he wrote in the very next chapter of that letter, "Follow my example as I follow the example of Christ." But here's the thing. Jesus is, of course, our best example of how to live and follow God. And the Israelites are a classic example of how not to. So hopefully we're never going to be as fickle and troubling to God as they were. But we're also unlikely to achieve the same level of perfection in doing that Jesus did. So what about ordinary people, like I will venture to say most of us? How do we fit in God's plan? So with that question in mind, today I want to look at what appears to me to be a very ordinary man named Gideon. There's only one Gideon mentioned in the scriptures, actually, so I assume you know who I'm talking about. Who was Gideon? That ordinary, huh? All right. In a nutshell, he was one of the judges of Israel during the period between the death of Joshua and the kingship of Saul. Now, you're probably aware that the judges were not always judges as we think of that word today. Most of them were actually military leaders, at least in the beginning. When I did this particular study years ago, I actually handed out a summary of everything the scriptures say about Gideon. It's not a terribly long list, but in fact it covers most of the 6th, 7th, and 8th chapters of the book of Judges. So if you want to refresh your memory, there's where you look. Let me note 3 major things about Gideon's role. First off, God called Gideon to lead Israel. Gideon then relieved Israel from the oppression of the Midianites, after which Gideon judged or governed Israel for 40 years. That's pretty much the form of what we're told about, I'll say, most of the judges in the book of Judges, although we get more detail about him than we do about any of the others, except maybe Samson. So, if you would, get out your Bibles and turn to Judges chapter 6. I'm not going to read the whole 3 chapters about him, needless to say, but I am going to read some bits and ask some questions. So starting in verse 11 of chapter 6. The angel of the Lord came and sat down under the oak in Ophrah that belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, where his son Gideon was threshing wheat in a winepress to keep it from the Midianites. When the angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon, he said, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." "But sir," Gideon replied, "if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are all his wonders that our fathers told us about when they said, 'Did not the Lord bring us up out of Egypt?' But now the Lord has abandoned us and put us into the hand of Midian." The Lord turned to him and said, "Go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you?" So what's Gideon doing the first time he's mentioned? Yeah, threshing wheat. Where is he doing this? Yeah, in a wine press. Is that the usual place to thresh wheat? Why is he doing that? Yeah, precisely, to hide, to keep the Midianites from getting the wheat. Israel is at such a low point in their history that they are taking refuge in caves and hiding whatever food they can. This is the time when the scriptures describe the Midianites as like swarms of locusts. So why are things going so badly for Israel?
Basically, they left the Lord.
Yeah, the usual reason. They have turned away from God and fallen into idolatry again. Judges 6 records that God sent them an unnamed prophet who explained this to them. "I said to you, I am the Lord your God. Do not worship the gods of the Amorites in whose land you live. But you have not listened to me." I want to put this in perspective so we understand just how far they have sunk. In Judges 6:25, God tells Gideon, "Tear down your father's altar to Baal and cut down the Asherah pole beside it." Gideon does it, but he does it at night because he's afraid of how the people around him will take that. And sure enough, when the locals find out who did it, verse 30 says, "The men of the town demanded of Joash, 'Bring out your son, he must die, because he has broken down Baal's altar and cut down the Asherah pole beside it.'" So whose altar has he torn down? Yeah, but who did it belong to? His father's altar to Baal, his own father. And who are these men wanting to kill him for tearing it down? Yeah, they're the people of his own tribe. Other Israelites. That is how bad things are. Okay, let's look at Gideon himself. Given what we know of his circumstances at this point, why does God choose him to liberate Israel? The answer to that question is we don't know. We can hypothesize a lot of reasons. Maybe God knows Gideon's heart and he's simply the man he wants. I think that's entirely possible. Maybe God wants Israel's deliverer at this point to be someone from a clan of Baal-worshiping nobodies in the middle of a Baal-worshiping area. Maybe God knows it's a good place to start a war against the Midianites. For all I know, God does it so people will ask the question, why him? Because we are asking the question. And since we're not told, we're speculating here now. If you've been in one of my classes before, and those of you in here today certainly have, you know, I have a habit of asking questions that don't have definitive answers. I make a point of doing that because I don't really believe we should have our understanding of God based on simply repeating the facts we've memorized or other people have told us, however important they are. So if a class doesn't make you stop and think at least about something, it's not succeeding as far as I'm concerned. So back to Gideon. Judges 6:12. The angel of the Lord comes to him, and the first thing he says is, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Is Gideon a mighty warrior? No. No. Not as far as we know. There's no indication he's ever struck a blow at this point, and he certainly doesn't describe himself that way in a minute. He doesn't start off his career by acting like a mighty warrior either. So it seems safe to say, well, God knew what Gideon could be, and God intended Gideon to be the man, but beyond that, we don't know. So what do you think is a message for us in this kind of interesting introduction to Gideon?
God may call you to unfamiliar roles.
Certainly that is true. Actually, my answer to the question is another question. We know God doesn't normally come and speak to us directly nowadays. Suppose he did. Suppose an angel of the Lord appeared to you and said, "The Lord is with you, mighty hero of the church." What would you say in response?
I'm no hero.
Sorry?
I'm no hero.
Yeah. Who, me? And I suspect my first response actually might be something like Gideon's. If the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where have you been, Lord? How come we're not doing any better? And how come so-and-so isn't happening? What Gideon does, the very first thing, it seems to me, is skip over what God says about himself and try to turn this back to God. You know. Well, what was God's response to Gideon's complaint? This is verse 14. Yeah, go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you? I rather doubt that's what Gideon was expecting. So what's Gideon's come back to that? How does he respond to being told, I am sending you?
How shall I deliver Israel?
Yeah. How shall I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I'm the least in my family. So he's like, no, I'm not really the man. Well, there's a question for you. When Gideon answers that way, do you think he's being humble, or he's just recognizing the facts of life, or he's afraid, or he's trying to dodge the responsibility? All of the above, yeah. That was my thought, I admit. Okay, let's look at, sorry?
He's another reluctant leader.
Yes, very much so. I probably wouldn't be quite as candid as Gideon was, but, you know, if you've never looked at some challenge that needed doing and at least thought, I'm not the person to take that on, or what can I do, or it's too big for me, then you're a more confident person than I am. But let's not be unrealistic here. What's the difference in our situation and Gideon's? Well, there's one difference. He's got an angel of the Lord sitting under the tree in front of him, staring in the face, saying, this is what God says to you. God is in his face, so to speak.
Also, he has an obvious enemy.
True. He has a known and understood, if you please, enemy and a problem that needs dealing with, and God says you're the man to do it. I mean, that's about as clear as you get. So what can he say to, well, what does he say to that?
Not me.
Yeah, well, and after God says, yeah, you, then what does he say? Verse 17.
He wants a sign.
Yeah, give me a sign that it's really you talking to me. And we're going to see some more of this kind of response from Gideon, of course. That characterizes pretty much everything he does at this point. We're not told what motivates him to do that, but I think it's fair to ask what kinds of reasons a person might have for asking God to confirm that what he says will happen. What are some possibilities? Why, you might say, is it really you talking to me? Ty?
Well, the scriptures tell us that the devil can appear as an angel of light.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
are you doing this to mess with my family, or are you really God?
Are you really our God? Yeah. Is this really happening the way it appears? Or am I being deceived? Am I dreaming? Am I just deceiving myself? Is God really speaking to me? Another possibility, lack of confidence in himself. I've never done anything like this before. Why do you think I can do this? Lack of trust in God. Haven't heard from you lately. Why now? Are you really going to do something? Dragging his feet. I don't really want to do what you're asking of me. Convince me. Well, here's a hard question for you. Did Gideon require more reassurance than the rest of us? Was he notably bad in this regard compared to you and me, for example? What do you think? I see at least one head or two heads shaking no.
I think he was braver than us. I think after like the first instance, we would have been like, okay, got it. Gideon's like, no, I won't work for it. Nope.
Yeah. Now that I understand what you want, run away. Yeah, that's certainly a possibility. Well, we've been sort of nibbling around Gideon's thinking and motivation. Let's talk about his actions. He wants to be sure it's actually God speaking to him. So he asks the angel to wait while he prepares a sacrifice, a sacrificial meal. He goes off and does that. The angel tells him to put it on a rock. And then if you look at Judges 6:21 and 22, with the tip of the staff that was in his hand, the angel of the Lord touched the meat and the unleavened bread. Fire flared from the rock, consuming the meat and the bread, and the angel of the Lord disappeared. When Gideon realized that it was the angel of the Lord, he exclaimed, sovereign Lord, I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face. And God had to reassure him at that point that he wasn't going to die.
Evidently, the Lord spoke to him directly, not through the angel.
Yeah, because that's the change in what the text says there. The angel is speaking to him, the angel disappears, and then God tells him. So it sounds that way. Okay, when the angel torched his offering and Gideon had to admit that he really had been speaking to the Lord's messenger, what did he do about it then? What was his first response after, sorry?
It was fear.
Yeah.
He's afraid he's going to die because he saw the face of the...
And how did that then manifest itself in action? What did he do? He built an altar. Why did he build an altar?
Well, he called it the Lord is peace, because the Lord brought peace to him.
Yeah.
The Lord's peace.
It's kind of a rhetorical question. I mean, he built an altar to offer a sacrifice on. That's why people build altars. But in the Old Testament, that seems to have been pretty much the standard response to almost any encounter with God or almost any event that showed God working. I did a quick search. The number of people who we are told built altars to God is just almost unending. Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, Aaron, Joshua, the Reubenites and the Gadites, Samson's parents, Samuel, Saul, David, Elijah. And that's not all of them. That's just some of them. So how about us today? Is there a modern day equivalent of building an altar to God? This could go a lot of ways. And in fact, it's easy to get tangled up in the metaphors here. But I think there's at least one clear answer to this, and it's in Hebrews chapter 13. Let me read you that passage starting in verse 10. We have an altar from which those who minister at the tabernacle have no right to eat. The high priest carries the blood of animals into the most holy place as a sin offering, but the bodies are burned outside the camp. And so Jesus also suffered outside the city gate to make the people holy through his own blood. Let us then go to him outside the camp, bearing the disgrace he bore. For here we do not have an enduring city, but we're looking for the city that is to come. Through Jesus, therefore, let us continually offer to God a sacrifice of praise, the fruit of lips that confess his name. And do not forget to do good and to share with others, for with such sacrifices God is pleased. So the Hebrew author seems to be saying, our altar already exists. All we have to do is to offer the right kind of sacrifices on it. Now, he's not talking about sacrifices for our sins. Hebrews says at least a dozen times that Christ offered the only sacrifice that takes away sin. That's not the idea at all. But we are nonetheless expected to offer sacrifices to God, and praising him and doing good are the sacrifices that please him. Okay, Gideon built an altar, and he made an offering on it. But then verse 25 says, that same night, God told him to tear down the altar of Baal, build a proper kind of altar, and sacrifice one of his father's bulls on it. Mind you, it's only one Baal altar and a whole country full of them. So why is this the first thing God told him to do, instead of telling him start raising an army to throw out the Midianites?
Test of obedience.
That's a good possibility. Could have been a test, just to see if he would in fact follow God's instructions. Or could have been to build up his confidence before he took on something bigger. Or it could have been intended maybe even as a seed of revolution, so to speak, to get the people thinking. But it also seems likely to me that God is asking for a sign in return, if you please, from Gideon, that he is going to do what God says. Why are the Israelites being oppressed by the Midianites in the first place?
Because they're worshiping other gods.
Yeah, because they've fallen into idolatry again, and this is God's way of getting their attention and preparing them to turn away from it. After all, if Gideon himself is not going to set an example here and be prepared to follow through on it, what are the odds the people are going to do likewise with him as their leader? So, what kind of lesson might we draw from that for our own lives? Lots of possibilities. How about this for a suggestion? God wants to be sure Gideon is going to follow his guidance. Wanting to do great things for God is commendable and important, but it really has to go along with purifying our own lives and doing things God's way. God's not going to be impressed with our accomplishments unless we are, shall I say, his kind of people. The classic Old Testament example of this, bad example, is King Saul, who was always ready to do great things, but whose own life was full of sin and who often chose his own judgment rather than what God wanted from him. So God, in turn, was very seldom pleased with him. Well, okay. First step out of the way, Gideon does begin a campaign against the Midianites. At least he starts calling the tribes around him to arms. But having done that, he, I will say, vacillates. I guess you could say, well, he says to God, if you're really going to do this through me, give me a miraculous sign, and I want to specify what it is. And God does that. And then Gideon says, please don't be mad, God, but if you really, really mean it, give me a different sign. And God does again. I don't know about you, but this account has always really bothered me about Gideon. Don't you find yourself thinking that second request is really over the top? I mean, how much convincing does one man need? What does it say about Gideon, and why does God put up with it? Ty?
Well, I was going to say, think of how many times Moses had to be convinced.
Yeah,
So it's no different.
yeah. Gideon is not the only reluctant hero in the scriptures, that's for sure.
Kelly,
Yes,
I think God knows us. And
Right.
each individual, and he knows what it's gonna take to convince us of whatever.
yeah. Yeah, God knows Gideon. That is for sure.
And it's one thing to say yes when you're all alone on a mountainside. It's another thing to say yes when you got this huge army depending on you to lead them.
Yeah, or this huge people. Very true. I mean, an obvious answer is that Gideon's faith is actually still pretty weak at this point. But you got to suspect that God knows what Gideon's limits are. He also knows what he's capable of, so he encourages him. If you recall, he did have a little trouble jump-starting Moses and some others as well. Now, there's exactly one reference to Gideon in the New Testament, and I think that might shed a little light on this. Anybody remember where it is? He's mentioned one time in the New Testament. Hebrews 11, the Heroes of Faith section. You might turn there because I want to read that passage and ask a question about it. Hebrews 11, starting in verse 32. And what more shall I say? I do not have time to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised, who shut the mouth of lions, quenched the fury of the flames, and escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength, and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies. Now, I would say not all these actions apply to all these people. Which of them do you think apply to Gideon? Yeah, some of the explicit ones, they did this, certainly apply to him. But I'm going to suggest that one of them at least is whose weakness was turned to strength. Gideon does not begin his service to God as a strong leader, and in fact, God goes out of his way to emphasize where the strength lies in this relationship, as he does in a number of other cases. So what does that mean for you and me?
We should be relying on God.
Yeah, it's not our own strength that's going to make us succeed for God. God's willing to work with weak people. There's more than one occasion when he makes it clear that he deliberately chose someone with weaknesses. Now, this is not necessarily one of those cases, but what did he say to Paul about weakness when Paul wanted God to take away his thorn in the flesh that was really apparently bothering him?
My strength is sufficient for you.
Yeah. This is 2 Corinthians 12, verse 9. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. What did he mean? I mean, he wasn't just telling Paul, get over it and put up with it. Yeah, that's true. It's about my power and strength, not yours. So you can succeed in spite of whatever is against you. Okay, how about this as a further thought? Weakness is not an excuse for not serving God. Because in fact, that was part of Moses' ploy, if you please. Oh, I'm not a good speaker. I'm not really the person for the job because I'm not good enough, if you please. I don't have the talents or the skills or whatever. If things have to get done by people without weaknesses, they're not going to get done. God doesn't expect that, and sometimes he doesn't even want it, although I would argue that doesn't mean we need to be happy or complacent about our weaknesses. And I think we can see all those things really clearly if we look at Gideon's military campaign that he's going to do. Gideon, I would say, was a weak man in some respects, but that doesn't mean God himself was going to command the army, blow the trumpets, launch the attack against the Midianites. That was Gideon's job, and he had to do it whether he felt adequate or not. But then 32,000 men showed up to fight at Gideon's summons. What did God have to say about that?
Too much.
Yeah, too much, too many. Judges 7, verse 2, the Lord said to Gideon, "You have too many men for me to deliver Midian into their hands." I can almost hear Gideon thinking, what did you say? Because if you look at the rest of the story, we're outnumbered like 4-1. And you're saying, there's too many. Wait. Well, what was God's point?
It's me that's going to do it, not you.
Sorry?
I'm the one that's going to do it, not you.
Yeah, absolutely. If you do it with your own strength, who's going to get the glory? Not God. Well, there's a really obvious lesson for us there. But even an obvious point can raise some maybe not so obvious questions. How about this one? If weak people accomplishing things glorifies God, should we try to get weak people to do everything? Wouldn't that glorify him the most? What's that? Yeah, that's a good point. Weak people are accomplishing everything for God. That's a fact of life. But that's kind of like Paul asking in Romans 6, verse 1, should we go on sinning so that grace may increase? It misses the point of what God is saying. The idea is we need to depend on God's strength, not our own. I mean, God could have driven out the Midianites with an army led by a 12-year-old girl or by two guys with a bag of rocks or whatever. If the way he chose to do it is to have Gideon lead that campaign. And I'm going to say I don't think there's any reason to suppose that he chose Gideon because of his weakness and lack of experience, although he might have. But, on the other hand, we should not let a lack of competence and experience stand in the way of serving God. We might still be the best person for the task for any number of other reasons. I mean, God had reasons for choosing Gideon. He didn't explicitly say what they were, but that kind of says Gideon was the best man for the job, so to speak. He's the one God chose.
It's clear from the story that Gideon was being trained up.
Yeah, absolutely.
God was teaching him what he needed to know to be the judge for 40 years.
Gideon was not going to be a loser ultimately, however he started out.
Well, and continued even when he went to attack the camp, he was too afraid to do it.
Yeah, he's really shows signs of either weakness or reluctance for a long time, but he gets over it. Okay, does that mean it's okay if I'm incompetent at what I do for God because he knows I'm weak? Is that okay?
What do you mean by okay?
I mean, is that okay with God? For me to say, I'm no good at this. I'll do it, but, well, I mean, I'm going to say Gideon knew his qualifications for what God wanted him to do were pretty weak. He says, look at me. Look at my tribe. Look at me. But
Jerry, in his opening statement to God, basically he was critical of God.
he was what?
Critical.
Oh, yeah. Yeah,
The same thing with Job later on.
he tried to put it back on God. That was also, I'll say, a weakness. But here's the thing. When Gideon finally accepted the role, did that mean he was going to do a mediocre job of it? No, not really. Did he go on being a weak, vacillating military leader? No, he didn't. Depending on God for strength is not the same thing as expecting him to do it all, or expecting him to accept less than the best we are capable of. And from what we can see, Gideon went on to do the best he was capable of. Okay, one more question about God's actions in this case. He didn't make a habit of telling Israel's leaders they had too many soldiers. I think this is the only such incident, at least that I remember. What is it about this time that might have caused him to do that?
I think he was trying to show that God had not deserted them. They had deserted God. And he had all this power, but basically nobody raised the sword.
Yeah, they didn't really have to do anything other than what he said.
Just obey God.
Yeah, it's clear I'm saying, it looks to me like he's trying to make an extreme example of this is how things should work. You depend on me, I will make it happen. And maybe he was afraid Gideon would get the big head from leading a big army, who knows. But I think he wanted to give the Israelites an extreme example of his power that they would be likely to remember. I mean, he was responsible for all their victories in conquering Canaan in the first place. But they kept forgetting that. So maybe this is one of those, okay, I'm going to really remind you this time. I don't know. But is there a lesson for us in this rather unusual way God chose to give Gideon his victory? What do you think?
Besides the obvious, don't rely on yourself, rely on God.
Yeah, for sure. Well, you can sort of generalize this to say that a small group really trusting in God's ability can accomplish things far beyond what they might reasonably expect. They just have to recognize where the real strength lies. Okay, that was the first bill. What have I got left here to ask? I'll ask one question about Gideon's later life. There's only 9 verses about what happens after the campaign against the Midianites are over. Basically, Gideon becomes Israel's judge, their ruler, leader, for 40 years. But one of the curious things that is treated in detail is the ephod that Gideon made from the plunder the army gave. What's an ephod, by the way?
Breastplate, typically with jewels on it.
Yeah, it's a sort of, well, the word apron is used in some context. A thing you wear on the front of you that was intended to be worn by the Levitical priests. So why would Gideon have made such a thing? Probably couldn't have been used for its usual purpose in his town. As far as we know, there were no Levitical priests there. Why'd he do it? Doesn't say. I mean, it's wild speculation. They apparently were used sometimes for consulting God. There's an example of this in 1 Samuel 23. Maybe Gideon had some such idea in mind as that, especially since, according to a statement somewhere in Judges, the priesthood had fallen on bad times. Presumably he didn't make it to serve as an idol, although that is clearly what it became. So, question really is, what do we learn about this for our own benefit from what Gideon did and the consequences thereof? What's that say to me? I'm going to say, consider carefully the consequences of what you do. Gideon was governing a people who tended to fall into idolatry at the slightest provocation. He made an impressive golden object that could hardly have failed to be venerated in time. It's like he wasn't thinking. I mean, he really was. You can see this. Remember that bronze snake that God had Moses make that Hezekiah finally destroyed? God actually told Moses to make it and to use it, but it still became an object of idolatry in the end because the Israelites had that tendency. Okay, well, that was the second bell. I've got a summing up list here, but I think I'm going to say don't have time to do that. You take away whatever you did. Thank you very much for being here, and Andy should be back next week, I believe. So I shall go turn off the stream, which otherwise will run indefinitely.